Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. As I mentioned, we're going to get started right at the top of the hour. We do have people still logging in, and we'll just give them a minute to log in, but we have a lot of ground to cover today, a lot of interesting information for you, and hopefully it'll be helpful. And we'll get started right at the top of the hour. If you do have questions, as I mentioned, use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We'll get to your questions during the webinar. Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. By my analog watch, we are at the top of the hour, so we're going to get started here. I want to thank you for joining us today, ASMGi. We have a terrific webinar, and I'd like to say thanks to our partner, Arctic Wolf. Today's webinar is on the real impact of a breach, and I think this is going to be very, very useful to everybody on the webinar. I expect some of you have probably even experienced a breach, unfortunately. So without further delay, I'd like to turn it over to Steve Roesing, CEO of ASMGi. Take it away, Steve.
Great. Thank you, Paul. Thanks everyone out there for sharing some of your time with us today. It's a great topic, and certainly one that's really relevant. And when I was looking for an image for the for the intro slide, for the initial slide of this presentation, I noticed that this is really red. But I think it's pretty representative of the shock that comes with the reality of getting ransomware, right? So it looks a little Christmassy, right, with the red background and the green and all that stuff. But I can assure you, this is not a gift. And if anybody's seen a screen like this when they showed up for work on Monday morning or something along those lines, I'm sure it came with anxiety and a lot of those feelings, and is likely one of, if not the, kind of worst day ever from an experience standpoint. So that I can tell you that our job is to help you avoid situations like this, and that's what this webinar is really all about, and certainly something that we hope you can do. So I want to introduce our guest today, Bruce Cheney. Thanks for being with us today, Bruce. And why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your role at Arctic Wolf, and we'll start there.
Okay. Yeah. So my name is Bruce Cheney. I have 25 years experience in IT and security. Right now, I am a senior pre-sales systems engineer with Arctic Wolf. I work out of upstate New York. I live in the Albany, New York area. Prior to working with Arctic Wolf, I was working as a penetration tester, risk management, risk assessment, and then infrastructure technology throughout New York State from a consulting perspective, going back to Windows 3.5.1, Windows NT4, and all the way up through what we have today. So yeah, and excited to share this information that Steve and I put together for this. This is super important for people to understand what this risk really looks like.
That it is, and definitely glad to have you with us today, Bruce. My name is Steve Roesing. I'm the president and CEO of ASMGi, and I can tell you that we're very excited to partner with Arctic Wolf on solutions like this, and I think it's very meaningful and can certainly have an impact. And hopefully we're able to communicate those things today. And so just a little bit of an agenda. We could give you some background on ransomware in general and just kind of the nature of the industry and some of the current more public, I'll say, data breaches. We've probably heard of some of them. We want to actually go and dig into the dark web a little bit. And so I appreciate your help with this, Bruce, but we have some real screenshots and of real dark web views to share with you and talk through that stuff. And then we want to just kind of dig in a little bit on, like, how can we help solve these problems? So and then we have some gifts for the attendees of the webinar today. So let's get started. I thought we would start here by making a statement, a pretty bold statement, but at the end of the day, I mean, your cybersecurity should reduce your risk. I mean, that's the purpose, right? So it's interesting, I'll say, that a lot of times, people are putting programs in place and complying with various different frameworks and these kind of things and spending lots of money on security, and maybe not reducing their risk as much as possible, and the data breaches are still happening. But do you want to reflect on this some, Bruce? Or
no, yeah, it's an effectiveness problem, right? Is how we refer to it. Tools are getting beat. Tools, we see billions of dollars every year being spent on tools. And they continue to get beat. When you look at things like Kaseya, SolarWinds, the Exchange Hafnium, zero-day attacks, really any ransomware attacks that we see. Right now we'll talk about some of the stuff in the news, but these companies, they all had tools. They all had endpoint protection. They all had firewalls. Some of them probably had MFA, and some of them did user awareness training, and some of them did penetration testing and risk assessments, and they still got beat, right? The bad guys got in. So what we need to think about is how do we address that, right? And it becomes a people and processes solution versus just layering, more and more tools. Right?
Yep. I love the statement about the effectiveness challenge, because there's certainly no shortage of tools. It's very difficult to be a buyer, in my opinion, today in the cyber market. There are a lot of vendors, and everybody's, pitching that they have the silver bullet, right? To just buy this technology and you're good. It's very difficult, I think, in a lot of cases to be a buyer. So it's really about the rubber hitting the road, right? You have to actually do the stuff every day. And I think it's a really neat perspective and a great way to start talking. So why do security leaders feel today like they're not as confident about security in general?
Yeah, it boils down to risk and ultimate risk appetite. On the slide before this, it was 87% of security or leaders believe that they're not where they should be. They don't sleep well at night, right? Day in and day out, I talk to business leaders. They're concerned, they're nervous, and it's because of the risk. So when we talk about the risk today, overall risk is really two different things that we look at. The likelihood of it, and then the impact of it. And when we look at those together, we get this overall risk. So when we think of things like, ransomware or data exfiltration or business email compromises with, money transfers and things like that, today, the likelihood of this stuff, basically, first off, it's a coin toss. 59% of organizations were breached last year, right? So that's either you or the person next to you, right? So it's not, when it's going to happen or, if it's going to happen, but it comes down to that, when is it going to happen, right? And especially in New York State, which we'll look at in a couple of minutes, where I am, it's a big issue, a big, risk. These guys just come after our businesses, and it's really in the whole Northeast. Just brutal the way that they attack us. And then from our own, at Arctic Wolf, we have thousands of customers in this multiple tenant platform. And, our information and our technology tells us that it takes 40 days for critical patches to be implemented in, these are our customers' networks, right? So this is when we're bringing to them saying, hey, You've got this patch, you've got this exchange hafnium thing. It has to be taken care of. You've got to patch this. And on average, 40 days it was taking businesses to, to get that, when they don't have, a rigid patch management infrastructure, and they're just kind of, winging things. So, all of that stuff, that 40-day window, that increases the likelihood of these incidents. And then what's the impact, right? So the impact becomes first a cost, right? So you have $8.6 million on average, and that's just what gets reported. There's a lot of things that don't get reported. There's a lot of businesses that never recover, but 8.6 million, could be a lot worse for a lot of other companies. When we look at data weaponization and things like that, it really starts to turn, ugly. And then 206 days of what we call dwell time. So this is the mean time to detect. 70% of the time when we onboard new customers, we find latent threats in their environments, right? The bad guys are there, they're getting in, they're beating the tools, they're getting credentials. And then once they have credentials, they're just hanging out in our networks, and they're authenticated, and they're able to install backdoors, and it's just being missed. The tools aren't seeing it, and they're just moving their way around, and they're weaponized. They're stealing our data, right? So they're taking 3 months to exfiltrate 700 gigs of data, and then they deploy ransomware, and we come into work on Monday morning and everything is locked up, and we say, oh, we're not going to pay you. And then they say, oh yeah, well, we're going to release all of your data. And here's some of your data, right? So they're hanging out in our networks, and they're not being detected. We're not seeing them, and they're just, going through recon and just really putting us in these really, really bad, positions.
Yep. And I tell you what I see when I look at a slide like this. So I'm an engineer, so I'll go to the math, right? But risk equals likelihood times impact. So if either likelihood or impact, if either one of those things, it's multiplication, just, do the math. If either one goes to zero, then risk equals zero. That's a great situation to be in, quite honestly, right? So if you patch your vulnerabilities regularly, then theoretically you can drive the likelihood down, right? If that number gets smaller, then the risk gets smaller. Early detection, like 206 days being the average dwell time, is just mind-boggling to me. But if you're able to shorten that time period and detect an intrusion early, with 24/7 eyes on glass by looking for indications of compromise, it's a great way to lower the risk. So I can say with certainty that this program that we're going to unveil and educate on today will lower risk. There's absolutely no question about that. And so I think this is a great example of the math. Let's talk about a couple of examples. These are some of the things that are in the news. Maybe some of the audience has heard of them already, but maybe you can just go through some highlights from some of these.
Yeah, this was our universal healthcare system got hit, ransomware, 400 facilities. The reason that I put this in here is 4 people died directly related to this ransomware attack. Yep. So when they don't have, information about patients and about patients' medicine and prescriptions and things like that, and when ambulances need to be rerouted and they just can't get things together because everything's locked up, 4 people died. When you think of Maersk, right? Maersk, the big shipping company, when they got hit years ago, I don't know if it was 2017 maybe, but they had 45,000 computers around the world locked up. And off like the coast of New Jersey, there were hundreds and hundreds of shipping of vessels with thousands of shipping containers on them. And these things longer than 5 football fields. I mean, just huge boats that couldn't come into port because they weren't able to figure out where the containers on all of these, so that type of, logistical information. And when it hit this hospital, it resulted in deaths, right? So there's, monetary issues, and then there's, these types of things that we're trying to fight against as well.
Right. And that, what's interesting is some of the more sophisticated hackers have said, hey, we're not going to attack healthcare systems because of those reasons, right? And yet they are.
Right. And that after this attack is when they came out and said, okay, we won't do this. But then there's other groups. There's a group in Cuba that, the adversaries down there are actively attacking healthcare. They do not care. Right. They just want money, right? It's a game for them.
Right. Travelex.
Yeah, the point of this one is they went through it, they got hit with ransomware, they never recovered. So they paid the 2.3 million in Bitcoin, and they still filed for bankruptcy, and they had thousands of retail stores. They were, a big player, never recovered. So,
Yep.
Yeah, whatever the ransom is one thing, but the, again, cost of recovery
Right.
here is just
right. And I think statistically, like if you're a large enterprise, the cost may be higher for recovery from ransomware, but you're likely to survive. But if you're a mid-market or a small company, I mean, there's a very high likelihood that it's lights out, right? If you get hit with an event like this, I mean, it could be catastrophic enough to end your business completely. So it's serious. It's serious business. There's no question. Many of us have used Travelex in our at some capacity or in an airport. So in any event, good stuff. This one's pretty popular to talk about, right? So a lot of people have talked about this for several reasons. What do you think?
Oh yeah, all over the news, right? This was the big, we hit infrastructure, and now we're not going to hit infrastructure anymore after this. But again, that group, potentially disappeared, new groups show up, and now we get the argument of,
I'm going to talk about this a little bit later.
Yeah, right. That's today. And I just read a negotiation thread from that. And
you're breaking up, Bruce. I think you're frozen.
Guys were all over the news. This was just really bad password management, lack of user awareness, and just understanding you can't use the same password on LinkedIn that you're using to log into your Citrix server, to log into your Office 365. And that's what this was. This was a case of something similar to that, just
what jumps out at me about this from an example standpoint, the $4.4 million ransom was at the time the largest ransom ever asked for by the bad guys, but it's not anymore. But it affected a lot of people. But I see this used as an example of an OT data breach. But the data breach was actually on the IT network, right? So the OT network was shut down because of the data breach on the IT network. So it's interesting from that perspective, but a lot of impact, to your point earlier, as a result of this. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of those examples and go through those. This is very real stuff, but let's just get into the current landscape, and maybe you can just walk us through and reflect on some of this stuff.
Yeah, I don't think this stuff comes as a surprise, and maybe the numbers do, but the ransomware attacks, $18.8 billion is what it cost businesses in 2020. It was a 74% increase in 2019, and then that was a 485% increase going into 2020. So it's just getting worse, right? There's more organizations now. We have there's Our Evil, and there's CLOP in these groups, and now there's Black Matter that's out there, and that's the one we'll talk about in a second. But it's getting worse, and they have protection. So when we deal with the majority of these ransomware attacks are Russian adversaries. We know who some of them are, and they're just not being turned over. It's almost like a that type of game where they're not giving us the ability to stop these people. And now it's just parlaying into, ransomware services. $1.8 billion for business email compromises. These are those wire transfers because somebody gets, a hold of somebody's mailbox, and and I've seen it happen at small sizes where it's a couple $1,000s, up to millions of dollars.
Yeah. So there's a Toyota supplier. So I use this as an example, but a Toyota supplier, 37 million. So the $37 million, that's a pretty large mistake, right? But there was an executive in finance that was coerced into changing his bank account information and depositing $37 million into a bad guy's account. It's mind-boggling, but this is a very popular attack vector. So we're seeing tons of this stuff.
Yeah. And we talked about the weaponization. So, with the fact that it's taking 206, which is more than 6 months of time, that they're in the network. So they're stealing that data. They're going to hit you with ransomware, but they're going to steal the data. And then they're going to ask you to, hey, pay us, right? Give us money. Or, if you don't, we'll release that stolen data to the dark web.
Yep.
All right. So, we pay them and hopefully we get the key, and that will allow us to unlock the data and make it usable. And then, sometimes more importantly, it stops the data from being posted, publicly, like we heard in the news recently that Washington DC was in a ransomware situation, and they released the psych evals of 34 cops. Just, hey, oh, you don't want to pay us, and a negotiation got really bad, and it was almost like the police department had amateur negotiators on, and the price went up, and calling their bluff, they released 34 psych evals. So, and these are just regular people like you and I that, they apply for a job, they got to take a psych eval, it's part of their, and then boom, here it is, world. Everybody gets to see this now, and we've seen the bad guys even going so far to call employees of businesses and say, hey, we tell your boss to pay us. Here's your social security number. Yeah. And now I just work there. I just answer the phones there. I'm just an account rep. And now these bad guys, are calling me to have my boss pay. And they're telling me my personal information, saying we're going to use this if he doesn't pay. Right. So put some pressure on him. It's horrible.
Yeah. I'll share, I didn't include a slide on this, but my perspective on paying ransoms has changed, quite honestly. And I used to be pretty adamantly opposed to paying ransoms, because my philosophy was, if you pay the ransom, you're going to end up on a list as somebody who pays the ransom. So you probably get attacked again, right? So just don't pay the ransom. And I think that's just the position that the FBI comes. But what I realized as I thought through this more is it's a business decision, right? If you're a business and you're faced with making a decision, I pay the bad guys, I get the decryption keys, I'll be down for, however long, 4 days, 5 days, a couple of days, whatever the case may be, but I can get back to operations. And if I don't pay the ransom, I have the potential to be down for 14 days or even longer, really, to fully recover and those kind of things. But I think that the perspective shift for me was, like, our job as a service provider then, and is to, like, put people in the position that not paying the ransom is a better business decision than paying the ransom, right? It should be the right business decision. So that, I think that at the end of the day is really what we're trying to help people do, is make, good business decisions and not have to pay the ransoms. And I think ransomware will go away if people stop paying them, right? If that ends up not being a good way to make money. But right now, the bad guys just really want to get paid.
Well, right. And it's like you said, these businesses need to get back up and running, and it could be the difference between having to go out of business or paying. And, we have cyber insurance and things like that, and maybe they'll cover some of it. Maybe, I don't know, but we'll be back in business. We won't right. stop. And depending on what you can afford for downtime, with the FBI, I've done panels with some of those guys over there, and I've sat through some ransomware attacks on the, years ago, and worked when the FBI showed up saying, hey, you're about to have a ransomware attack. And I was like, nope, we've actually caught it here. And we don't have one. But and their stance is, they don't want you to pay, like Steve said, but they also under their breath will say, but if you're going to pay, let us know, because we'll tell you if the people you're dealing with are legit. Right. Like, do you have the right people? They
have a reputation for actually.
Right. What are the chances that they're really going to give you the key back? Is it going to work? Are they reputable? Because they do look at it as an enterprise business. And when you get that key back, they give you a whole security document on how they broke in and what you need to do to harden your, like, they treat themselves like they're security professionals.
That's right.
They break in and then steal everything. And then, oh, here, here's what you need to do to,
Right.
fix it. It's 20
You know,
million.
you hit on a key point, and I won't go down this rabbit hole, but cybersecurity insurance is a really interesting topic, and we'll do a webinar on that someday. Right?
Yeah, no,
We could
it's a hot
we could spend
topic.
the entire time talking about that, but it used to be like people felt like, hey, it's okay, I have a cyber policy, the insurance is going to pay the ransom. But today that is not true. There are a lot of cyber insurance companies are making it harder to get policies,
Right.
and a lot of them are doing exclusion. Talk about the ransomware as a service a little bit, because I think this is really important for people to understand.
Yeah, this is what you have with like your groups like this Black Matter, this new group that's out, and your R Evil. So they are providing a service. So the same way that, Arctic Wolf might provide a SOC as a service, or somebody might have infrastructure as a service, or security as a service, or whatever. These guys now have ransomware as a service. So they have their affiliates, their cronies, the thugs running around trying to break into networks. And when they get into the victims' networks, they then go back to the ransomware operators, and they go through now and encrypt the ransom. Right? They encrypt the data. They take care of all the negotiations and everything, and then they keep a little piece of it and give the rest of the money, back to the operators. So. The affiliates are just running around breaking into places. They don't have, call it, the skills to do the ransomware. So the RAS operators are just, taking care of it all in the back end.
Yeah.
So this is why, when we hear, that our evil was compromised, or our evil was seized, the feds seized it, right? But we don't really hear it in our news and things like that. It's very well like an out that could be executed, where they got the money for Colonial Pipeline, and then, all of a sudden the feds took all the money, and they could just be taking the money themselves and saying, oh, that's it, we're disbanded, we're done, they took our money. And in that case, whoever actually broke in there is now getting stiffed, as well. So it's not always,
Right.
what we might hear.
Right.
Surprise,
surprise. It's not always above the line, right? But and I think it's important to understand that the operators of RAS are the sophisticated attackers who actually know what they're doing, right? So they build these. It's like any other as a service business, right? So they have some expertise, and they leverage that to build and make it cost effective and easy for anybody who maybe doesn't have those skills, as you mentioned, and expertise to really pull off a ransomware attack for a nominal fee, basically a portion of the ransom. So it's important. So this is the example that you've referenced a couple times, and I just, this just went public yesterday. So this actually happened earlier this week. But what's interesting is Black Matter, the group that is pegged for being responsible for this, and I should caveat all this with say allegedly, right? Because it's some of the information is being made public now, but I think there's a lot more to come on this. But Black Matter is an interesting group because there's a connection there to DarkSide, which is responsible for the Colonial Pipeline attack. But anyway, this is a group that said they disbanded, right? And so now they're an operator for. It's crazy business, right? But this is real stuff, and I think this is a good example for highlighting that this can happen to anybody. I mean, this is a farm, a community of farmers, right? That basically, and all in Iowa, and they're getting attacked with ransomware. 5.9 million is the ransom request on this. It's just phenomenal. It's mind-boggling.
Yeah, and our threat intelligence team just posted maybe an hour ago a thread, the negotiation thread that's going on in the dark web between these guys and Black Matter, and these guys are standing fast. They're like, and it's funny because they, basically had some good old American slang, humor back at these guys with. Just we're not paying, kind of no way, no how, go away, forget it. And it's it's funny. So it's not even, even when they came back and threatened to expose data, and we're just like, nope, no. And it's funny.
Yep. So you mentioned this earlier, and you brought this up that we'd get to this, but I just wanted to just quickly, just for everybody's benefit, just identify, where are we seeing the majority of the breaches happen?
Yeah, so this is the FBI's crime report for 2020. And, you're seeing Florida and California are the big, hot spots with, 40,000 or more victims last year. New York, Texas, just between that 30 and 40,000 number. And then Illinois in there, your Pennsylvania, New Jersey, that whole East Coast, Northeast, excluding Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts.
Yeah.
So it's,
it's phenomenal when you add the numbers up. I mean, it's just, it's mind boggling.
Right. Yeah. This is the money now involved. So New York State alone, 400, million, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Virginia, 200 million, that's a ton of money that these guys are making off of our, our victims, it's like,
yep.
Oh, this slide I add in, it's, if I was to show you this 4 years ago, it would just have banks on it, right? That was the big target. Now
right.
It's everybody. So we add this in to say, this doesn't matter what you're in, you saw the manufacturing getting hit, it doesn't matter. Your vertical, it's opportunistic. I dealt with a ransomware attack where a car dealership got breached, business email compromise. So they get a sales guy's mailbox, and they're like using GoDaddy hosted mail, no multi-factor. It's Indrik Spider, Russian cybercrime group. They take the guy's mailbox and they reply to all of his sent items with well-crafted attachments. One going back to my recipient, an insurance agent, about a Ford F-150 truck that they were getting insurance cards for. My insurance agent opens up the email. Bad guy opens up the attachment, I should say. Bad guys are now in, right? So beat all the tools at that point, right? And then at that point, it was detected and contained by Arctic Wolf. But regardless of that, it was just an opportunity. They had this guy's mailbox. Look at, he's talking to this person. So whatever industry you're in, you're a target. It doesn't matter. They don't care. There's no, even in that, the last one we just looked at where the negotiations going on, they're saying, hey, we are critical infrastructure. And the bad guys are like, no, you're not. You guys make profit. Like, you're a for-profit company. You're not an infrastructure. Right. Sorry, you're going to pay us 5.9 million.
That's right.
And then they're like, we're not paying you. And it's, and it turns into this country boy, let's fight.
So here's a pop quiz for you, Bruce. Does ransomware care what industry you're in?
All right. No. Yeah.
No, in fact, it doesn't. And all industries are targets. And I think that's a key takeaway, from certainly from this, from this slide and the last slide. I mean, this is the same information basically, but it's a business, right? And so the bad guys just want to get paid. They just want to make money. And so if they can cause enough harm to, inflict enough harm on you so that paying the ransom is a better business decision than not paying the ransom. That's what they're hoping for. This one talks a little bit about the money last year from ransomware cases by industry. Any reflections on this?
No, just again, it's more just proving the broad spectrum.
Right.
And that, the way to think of it is the bad guys are smart, right? They do their homework, they're in companies for 6 months. So once they're in, they can then figure out, where are we? What is this? Oh, okay. All right, let's see now. Oh, wow. Okay. They're a publicly traded company, or, oh, they're worth this, or they have 200 million in annual revenue, or whatever. Right. And then they know we can ask them for 10 million, or boy, they're a mom and pop shop in Saratoga, New York, and they have 30 employees. And you know what? We're just going to get 25,000 from them, because that's what they can afford and they're going to pay. Right. And, and go from there. So it's all over the place. It's every industry.
Yeah. And I think a key metric to understand is that the costs are going up, right? And this is cost per incident. This graph represents cost per incident of ransomware, $7.1 million in healthcare. I mean, it's phenomenal, right? And obviously we saw the healthcare slide that you had. Lives were lost. You can't put a price tag on that, quite honestly, but bad things are happening all over the place. So what are causing breaches today?
Yeah, so remote infiltration. So this is your poorly secured, exterior, your ports, your services, weak password management, no multi-factor authentication. Companies still don't have that on every public login. And at that point, bad password management, purchasing credentials on the dark web, which is what happened with Colonial Pipeline, or just going out and searching for them, right? If you know where they are on the dark web, excuse me, you could go and find them and look at them. And then when people are using the same password, or, when I was a pen tester, that was one of the things I would do to help me break into a company. So I would go on the dark web and I would look for, their employees' passwords on other sites. And I mean, more than once I would see things like a password, where somebody's password or their work email address was used on, say, 5 sites that were breached. LinkedIn, Dubsmash, and I can't think of any other ones, Adobe, and whatever. And all the passwords would be like Margaret 1, Margaret 2, Margaret 4, Margaret 5. And I would look at it and be like this guy, no, there's no way that his Active Directory password is Margaret 3. It's 4, Margaret 7. Margaret, oh, here it is, it's Margaret 8, and just because he's just, what I mean? And
right.
Following those types of things and gaining access. Software vulnerabilities and poor patch management, even after the fact, when things happen, Exchange Hafnium, and those patches come out, or Print Nightmare, or the proxy stuff that's out now, where the proxy logon. So there's things and mitigations, and people just don't get to them. And as soon as something comes out and it gets announced, oh, this new 0 day, and Microsoft released 4 new patches for some 0 days. As soon as that happens, the world of bad guys now starts developing to try to figure out how to breach that, banking on the fact that people are not going to have patches, in place right away. And some businesses do, but I can tell you, when I was a consultant for New York State, our patches were, sometimes a monthly thing. It would be 30 days later before we would be getting to a patch, based on the fact that we had hundreds and hundreds of servers to patch and needed to make sure high availability and things like that. So, the bad guys are able to leverage those types of things, those business processes, and get in. And then phishing, right? 90% of the time, users are the reason that companies get breached. They're clicking attachments, they're opening things, they're visiting, sites that they shouldn't, they're, clicking links, they're hitting a non-SSL, landing page for DocuSign and being duped into it, or, they're just bad, it's the users, right? So we tie it into phishing, but they're the big problem on the network. And as, building that culture, getting them to report, when things happen, things that make them go, did something just happen? Should I say something? And getting to understand it, definitely can help. But really, all 3 of those things, high level, are the reasons that companies are getting breached. And it might be a combination of them. Like a user opens an email and gives me control, and then there's bad patch management, which allows me to laterally move through a network, undetected.
And it's a known fact that, like, business email compromise, to your earlier point, right? If you sit there long enough and you're in the inbox or of your user, because you've logged in with their credentials, right? And you're seeing all the emails, and you respond with a payload and attachment that looks real, right? There are a lot of breaches that are happening as a result of that. And somebody just opens the attachment because it looks valid, right? It looks like a valid file, but it downloads and installs a payload. So bad things are happening. There's a question that came in. I want to throw out there, Bruce, and just get some of your reflections on. Is this not a form of electronic warfare, or some of these nation state sponsors? Is anything being done to treat this as something more than criminal behavior?
So, all right. So this is a really interesting question. It's So there's a group called Sandworm, right? And there's a whole book. It's called Sandworm. It was written by a guy from the press who kind of followed these Russian hackers around, figured out who they were, and we knew who they were. And at one point, they knocked the Ukrainian power grid down.
Right.
So they took basically half of Ukraine and knocked the power grid. And it was months of no power throughout a winter. I think that was in 2018, maybe that happened. And we didn't really say anything, right? We just kind of sat back and just let it play out. And the reason that we didn't say anything is because then we as a nation state don't have that ability to do that to other people. And when you go back, there was something called Stuxnet that happened, where Iran was building nuclear reactors. One way or another, still really not known today how we infiltrate, or I say we, the Israelis kind of take the fall on the sword for this, but whoever it was somehow must have had an insider, got this malware, this worm inside there, and it made the reactors where they were trying to refine uranium get out of sync, and it would cause them to explode and to break, and they couldn't do it. And people were shot over that, and the whole entire program basically failed because somebody did a cyber attack. And then just recently, it was attributed to Israel again in the past 6 months, doing the same exact thing to them, basically infiltrating their nuclear program and breaking it down. And that's why Iran is such a big threat, because for the past 20 years since that Stuxnet thing happened, they've been just growing hackers to attack the US infrastructure. So yeah, they are state-sponsored actors. Companies like Russia are just not going to give them over to us. And we don't really do too much, because we're doing the same stuff to other businesses around the world, to our enemies and our, adversaries. So like China, for instance, right? They're always just coming for our intellectual property. And we have spies over there playing the same, the same games. Like SolarWinds, they still don't know where that came from. Could be Russia, could be China, right? Because there wasn't really ransomware. It was more about stealing data. And that's not the Russians,
That's
MO.
not the MO.
That's the Chinese don't want our money. You take that look at the North Koreans, and those guys just want money. They go after banks, and they go big or go home. They'll go after $1 billion. The Bank of Bangladesh is a great story that the Lazarus group from North Korea did.
Right.
And then the Iranians are the infrastructure guys. They just want the.
And I think it's worth noting that, I think that the U.S. in general is starting to take notice of just the frequency and the cadence, the sheer volume and numbers, right, are staggering. But from a nation state attack standpoint, so, Biden's having some conversations directly with Putin and saying, don't do this, right? But it's very difficult to prosecute in a foreign land, and catch people who are operating from a foreign land, and particularly if the government is sponsoring their activities, right? So and to your point, we do a lot of these behaviors ourselves, so it would be hard to mandate that they can't, happen on the world stage. But in any event, there is, and this is, this breach that we brought up in Iowa, there is a debate going on, right? Is that critical infrastructure? Is it not critical infrastructure? That may be a big part of the negotiation. It's quite honestly, but that's we'll find out how that plays out. But I'll get us moving again. So I want to get into the dark web a little bit. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but I think it's a great representation, because it shows you that, the things that we think about the web above the surface is a very small portion of the web in general. And, as you get into the deep web, it's much more, it's large, it's very large, right? And then the dark web and stuff. And I won't spend a lot of time on this, but I want to get to the part, Bruce, where you can, talk through some of these examples from the dark web. So why don't you go ahead and.
Yeah. So basically, the dark web is just this little small piece of the deep web, and the deep web is just stuff that's not indexed, right? So you don't find it, you have to know where it is. And this little corner of it, this dark web, is just this little encrypted place. But anybody can get there. So you access it with a special web browser called Tor. So if you download Tor, and basically what it does, it's like a series of proxy servers that are all secure. So you just kind of hop around to all of these different, think of it like VPNs, if you will, and then you just surface. And when you surface, you could be in France, you could be in Japan. You just surface somewhere where there's an exit node, and gain access to resources. So in this little area down there, you can use this browser to go and find it. And then just a couple of Google searches, and you could locate, URLs and start. But I mean, it's not a good place, right? So This dark web is where the bad guys will post data. So when they tell you, oh, hey, you're in a ransomware, okay, we're going to see it right now for this group in Iowa, right? Are they going to really release their data? And we hear it. Oh, they leaked their data to the dark web. Well, what does that mean? And that's what this next slide is, a data leak. Mm-hmm. So this is a construction company that I think they were in Sacramento, California. They didn't pay the ransom, so they uploaded 720 gigs of data to this mega NZ, file sharing dark webs. It's another nonsense site that should just be blocked, but it's all there. And so this is just a picture of some takeovers, some blueprints, schematics, and things like that. The next slide is, so that's the REvil group. This next one is the CLOP cybercrime group. This is a company in Nevada. The data that they posted included things like passports. So these are just regular people, their passports, their social security numbers, all this information. This DTR document has social security numbers. At the top of it, you can see the blue squares, things are blanked out. Those are all universities and other businesses. One was in California, that's the .ca. One of the schools in there is Stanford.edu. So this is the group that hit Stanford, if you saw that in the news. The next one is, this is Dade City, Florida. Okay, so here they had, 120 gigs of police data, including like videos of the jails. And this Avedon group on the left side of that, it says new companies. I've graded out to protect the, I don't want to shame anybody, but those are all companies that are having their data leaked because they're not paying, right? So, and they're global, right? It's not just here in the US. I mean, the US has the money, so they come after us, but these are, companies in Switzerland and things like that as well. And then I think there's one more. This is the lawyers of the stars. These guys are down in New York City. They got breached, and for them, what they did was they didn't leak the data. They wanted the ransomware. They didn't believe it, so they leaked Lady Gaga's data. So you could go out and see her client privileged data, and for all the other stuff, the Nicki Minaj and the Bette Midler and the Springsteen, you can buy them. So on the REvil website, they're $600 each, and you can see. And this one got ugly. This one, they wanted like 20 million, and then it went to 50 million. And then the lawyers paid, they paid like 22 million. And then they were like, no, we wanted 50, and they released the data. It was like this huge catastrophe for these guys. But again, they knew they had, hundreds of millions of dollars and went after it. And so then this is still out there. These are all current, recent, if you get to the dark web, you can see this stuff. And now we won't watch and monitor and see if if this firm in Iowa, if their data, because that's what they're threatening. Fine, you don't want to pay us. We're going to release your data.
More to come on that. So
yeah, and it's this is famous people, but those other ones are just like regular people like you and I, that the companies, and whether they were doing their diligence or not, they got breached, and they didn't, my data got out there, and now the bad guys are calling and saying, oh, you work for this company? Yeah, well, guess what? Your passport's out there. We're going to put all your data out there. You better tell your boss to pay. Here's your social security number. And they're just doing this like robo dialing because they have all of the employee data.
That's right.
So it's like these guys, it fires me up.
Yeah. I think that, the message is that this is real, right? It can happen to anybody, and it is happening to anybody, right? So here's how we can help, right? So I want to go through this stuff, and we'll try to move through it pretty quickly. But one of the things that we talk about is the shift in thinking that's required really to address this issue, and versus the old way of thinking, which is, we call it the point solution mentality, right? So this is thinking about specific controls and project stuff. So what we see a lot of enterprises do is move, from one project to the next, right? Here's a project to implement this control. Here's a project to implement this control. And no look back ever really to validate that something works. This is that effectiveness problem that we talked about, right out of the gate, right? So, and this is the big challenge with security, in my opinion, right? So people never really take the time to make sure that it's effective, right? It's just boom, do this, do this, do this, do this, do this. So our counter to that is the new way of thinking, which is more holistic in nature, right? So there are some behaviors that this drives, but one of the things I think that's interesting that we say to a lot of our customers is a total solution by definition is the program, which is where the strategic objectives, it's the strategic document, right? You document the strategic objectives, the outcomes that are desirable, and the SLAs and SLOs and all that stuff goes into the program, plus the technology, plus the operations. And so what I see a lot of enterprises, fall short on is the operations piece, right? So we see a lot of people buying technology to solve problems, but somebody has to show up. This is the way I define operations, right? Somebody has to show up to work tomorrow and actually do this, right? In a lot of cases, it's the same person that's got like 10 other jobs, right? And, they're all of a sudden going to take on all these new things, right? So in any event, I thought it was a neat perspective to include, but it really, it maps quite nicely to this perspective of switching thinking from a tools perspective to an operational perspective. So maybe you can elaborate a little bit on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. The tools get beat, right? Every time there's ransomware, they have tools, they're getting beat. So by taking this operational mindset, the first step of it is using some type of a framework, right? And the NIST framework, which is what we're looking at here, is, kind of like the industry standard. It's a great place to start. But, really what you need to do across the entire, network of the entire business is you need to be able to identify, protect, detect, respond, recover, repeat over and over, continuous, call it guided, expertise along the journey. So identify, when a risk happens, or identify where the assets are, identify what we need to protect, right? Identify where the weaknesses are, and then protect them. Make sure they're secured with permissions, make sure they're air gapped for backups, right? Do all that stuff. Then detect when something happens, right? So up here, so we just have ransomware, we detect it, we contain it, we stop it. Then that's the respond, right? So you detect it and now respond. And then the recover piece, what happened? How did they get in? What can we do better? What can we change? Root cause analysis. Oh, and now we implemented something. Let's validate that that's now working while we continue along that process. So it's a very cyclical, process.
Yeah, that's very true. And I would maintain that if you do these things systematically, then not paying the ransom becomes the right business decision, right? That's the position that we want to put people in. So I like this reactive, proactive, and active component description. And I think if you look at all of those things, like the reactive piece, the manage, detect, and response, this is reactive, right? So there is an intrusion that happened, but you need to detect it, and you need to detect it early. So I think it's key understanding that the average time, that an intruder is on the network before they're detected is 206 days. That we're detecting intrusions in minutes. It's material when you're able to do that, right, and have that early detection, and so forth. The proactive piece is the vulnerability management, quite honestly, right? Patch. That's that's the mantra. And I maintain that a company's risk is not lowered by knowing that they have a vulnerability. Their risk is lowered when they fix the vulnerability, right? And I think that's important distinction, right? Because we see a lot of like vulnerability scanners out there. It's easy to generate a report as a managed security provider and hand it to their customer and say, here, go fix these, right? And, I frame that up as, creating work for the customer, but the risk is lowered when the vulnerability is fixed. And if all the vulnerabilities are fixed, it's a very critical part. So I want to make this point too. You have to know, A, that the asset exists, and B, that the vulnerability exists. And if you don't know that, you can't fix it. You can't prioritize it and fix them in order and those kind of things. But the active component is basically the operational piece, right? And so this is doing the things that happen in a SOC, like detecting intrusions and having that 24/7 on eyes on glass, I think is incredibly valuable. So that's, I'm going to keep moving a little bit, and you can reflect on some of those things as I go through this slide. But whoops, let me go back.
No, that's okay. Yeah, you can. So there's just a question there, and this will kind of, I guess, explain the slide too. But it says, how do you detect a breach before the ransom is demanded? And basically, you have to almost take the approach that they're going to get in and we're going to go and detect it. And to do that, you have to be able to watch the entire attack surface. You have to have broad visibility. You have to be looking at the endpoints. You have to be looking at the cloud. You have to be looking at the traffic. You have to be looking at the servers. You have to be looking at all the log files, and then correlate and aggregate that together with, threat intelligence to determine when things are happening. So for instance, a bad guy gets in as soon as they beacon out to a known command and control site, or as soon as they attempt to move laterally on the network, or as soon as they attempt to run a PowerShell on that host, that stuff gets detected. So they got in, and now you're using like a framework just like this, like the MITRE ATT&CK framework, to detect the lateral movement and all of the other things that are going to happen before the ransomware happens, right? So they're going to get in and they're going to have to move around and get control. That's when you have to catch them. You can't let them just, hang out. Even if they have credentials, you still need to be able to see that. So that's what the Arctic Wolf platform does, right? We look at all that broad telemetry, that visibility across everything, and bring it into our pipeline, where we then look at it and reach out to you.
I want to get to that part. And I would add, like, the metaphor that I use a lot when I speak to this question is, we've all seen the movies where the crown jewels are sitting in the museum on a pedestal in a room, and there are all these infrared lights around it. And, the bad guys show up with a baby powder and, blow it off their hand. And then you see all the infrared lights at every different angle and various different things. That's like an indicator of compromise and being able to identify those, right? When you break one of those beams of light, alarms go off. And this is what the MDR service really does, right? Is look for indicators of compromise. And the bad guys, they just have to make one mistake to set off an alarm, right? They just have to trip one of those beams of light in order to set off that alarm. And so that is really what MDR is all about, is tripping an indicator of compromise and detecting it early so that you can find the intrusions early. So I just wanted to talk about this MDR MSOC. So if you take all of the components of the Arctic Wolf solution, and we're gonna spend a little bit of time on the architecture in a second, but if the outcomes that are pervasive and that we strive for are preventing the attacks, right? Just prevent them to begin with. And the way that we do that is by vulnerability management, by identifying the vulnerabilities. Again, this holistic nature and really being comprehensive in the coverage. So not just looking at the vulnerabilities on premise, but the vulnerabilities in the cloud, the vulnerabilities in the OT network, the vulnerabilities in the devices that don't have agents in it, looking at the network traffic, the cloud, the internal vulnerability assessment, the external vulnerability assessment, and those kind of things, and training your users, right? Because that's a large attack vector. So prevent it from happening. And then, if people are going to get through anyway, minimize the impact if somebody does compromise your network. And so the best way to do that is through early detection and watching 24/7. So like the Kaseya attack, I heard you reference that earlier. It occurred over 4th of July weekend. There's a reason why it occurred over 4th of July weekend, because the attackers knew that people were generally going to be distracted, not at work and various different things, and they would be able to have time to, inflict damage and infect more users, right? But early detection is key. And containment, I want to make this point because you can do manual containment, and that's great. And I think it's a good idea in certain instances, particularly if it's life and death, right? If it's a manufacturing facility or a healthcare facility and those kind of things. But you can also do automated containment, right? So if somebody clicks on a link and downloads software, you can remove their laptop from the network. And I think that's a big piece of this, being able to do that containment. Having a structured and rehearsed incident response plan, I think, is another component that's key, right? And people you don't want the time that you have an incident to be like when you figure out who are you going to call, right? That's just practice. We say it all the time, but include a tabletop exercise, and have an incident response plan, and have all of the information and the contact information for all the references and the escalation plan and all these things, and how you're going to respond for specific instances. Have all of that documented. This really maps to that proactive, reactive, and active component of the thing. I'm going to skip over this because I want to get to this telemetry slide, because this is where the rubber hits the road, in my opinion. And this really speaks to how comprehensive in nature this is. But why don't you talk through this a little bit, Bruce, and just cover, the places that the data and the telemetry is coming from and how indicators of compromise are identified. And I think that answers that question.
Okay. Yeah. So basically what we're doing is we're taking broad visibility and ingesting telemetry from users, from the standpoint of their endpoints, but also from user awareness, phishing simulations, and things like that. Identifying users that always fail phishing tests, right? That's important to know, so we can make sure we're watching their devices maybe a little bit more, right? Anything in the cloud, right? Those log files and that telemetry needs to be ingested. The agent sitting on the endpoint, sitting on the servers, also collecting information with endpoint like Sentinel-1 and CrowdStrike and your Carbon Blacks and things like that, connecting directly to the cloud with an API to ingest that telemetry. Watching network flow, running IDS on the network, checking for vulnerabilities, misconfigurations, and all of that information gets ingested into this platform, the Arctic Wolf platform, which we built from the ground up. It gets enriched with commercial threat intelligence feeds. So we subscribe to about a dozen from like Proofpoint, Greenbone, companies like that. We have our own internal threat intelligence team. We have crowdsourced threat wisdom because we have thousands of customers in a multiple tenant platform. So when something happens to a customer in Sacramento, we can instantly apply that across the board for all of our customers. And then we have about 37,000 custom threat detect engines that we've created, and that grows every day. So all of that telemetry comes in for a company with 450 users, 150 servers, and 4 firewalls. That'll be about 165 million pieces of information a week. That will funnel through that enrichment process and come out to 765 investigations. This is where our SOC is looking at this, triaging it, figuring out what the deal is. And then based on that, 1 to 2 times a week, we're going to come to you with outcomes. So, either Steve and his team, or however it's configured, we'll let you know, hey, you have this going on and here's how you resolve it. Here's what you need to do. Here are the steps. When it's fixed, then we can come back and validate it and, continue that security journey.
Yep. Oh. Yep. Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for that. I'm keeping an eye on the clock. And so I know that I'm just going to fly through this stuff. I want to let everybody know that if you have additional follow-up questions, or if you want some more detailed information, then, please follow up with us and we can speak to you specifically about the pain points that you're having or the areas that you have questions on and those kind of things. But I'm just going to toggle through all this. I want to get to this, and I just want to mention this before everybody bails, because I know we're over on time already. But if you're looking for, so the bad guys are outside your network and they're looking at you. And a lot of times they use the same commercial tools that we use on the inside to protect ourselves, right? But let's just say that the bad guys can look from the outside in and gain a perspective on where your vulnerabilities are or where you're weak or those kind of things. So the giveaway for the attendees on the webinar is that we'll give you a report that shows you the same view that the bad guys are using, right? And so that's we have companies that we're working with that we're doing reports on that has started in a very bad situation, and we've been able to improve their scores. But it's very relevant information, and I just want to make that point. So if you want to just enter a yes in the question and A box, or send an email and ask for this, we're happy to send you a report that'll show you what the bad guys see when they look at your organization from the outside, and where your vulnerabilities lie, and those kind of things. So that said, yeah, so I think we're out of time, and I really appreciate everybody's attendance, and that we have a couple additional questions that we weren't able to get to. So we'll make sure that we send a response to those in writing. And I just want to say thank you. Any closing remarks, Bruce?
No, just I think, to have a plan, be ready, assume it's going to happen, and practice that plan. Go through it, tabletop exercises, that kind of stuff is really, it's not the time to figure it out when it happens.
Right.
So, yeah,
there'll be a few things on your mind if it happens, if and when it happens, right? So
right.
let's figure it out ahead of time. Thank you, everyone, for your time today. I hope this was informative for you, and please follow up if you have additional questions. Thanks, Bruce. Appreciate your
Thanks,
insight.
everybody.
Cheers.